Take it away.
Thank you. Thanks a lot for hosting this workshop. It's been really fun to get to talk to a lot of junior people about their ongoing research. So I'm really feel like I'm seeing live work, live and upcoming work. So that's been really fun. I'm going to talk also about some upcoming work that we're presenting at ICML in a few weeks. So if you have feedback for me, now is basically our last chance to incorporate it. And it's on this topic of representational comparisons. So I consider myself more of a cognitive scientist and a neuroscientist, more than a computer scientist. I'm definitely not a physicist, but I hope that some of the sort of problem settings that I'm going to present to you today are going to be of interest to you, and maybe we can talk about formalizing how learning dynamics and other aspects of statistical physics analyses might enter into providing solutions for some of the problems that neuroscientists are faced with. Okay, so representational comparisons, it's a bit of a mouthful, but I'm going to explain to you in this talk what that means and why I think neuroscientists right now are not really using the right tools in order to make claims about neural mechanism. Okay, so sort of the foundational principle behind my work and behind a lot of actually ongoing work in computational neuroscience is using this framework of connectionism. So the idea behind that is that cognition, so high-level behavior, comes as a consequence of computing over representations with some interesting structure. So the kinds of representations that neuroscientists are interested in are things like single neuron tuning properties. So here on the left, I've pictured sort of a more sparse representation that we see in median entorhinal cortex. So these are grid cells, and also a more distributed representation. So this is a single neuron that's sort of diffusely spatially selective. And neuroscientists are interested in characterizing, why these structures appear in certain brain regions and sort of what properties of the task promote them through learning. Also, neuroscientists are not just interested in single neurons, they're also interested in more higher level properties like population geometry. So they're interested in characterizing how, say, a manifold of stimulus representations changes over time through recurrent connectivity, or even how, say, a image stimulus is represented by visual cortex in humans. And by computations, computational neuroscientists look at things like linear classification over those same stimulus representations that I mentioned, and they also think about recurrent dynamics. So sort of, are there attractors in the dynamics of recurrent neural activity, and how does that relate to observed behavior? So those are the sorts of objects that neuroscientists are interested in. One thing that another sort of paradigm that this connectionism perspective allows us to make use of is, in addition to looking at these very specific properties about representations and computation, is that it allows us to posit deep neural network models, so sort of end-to-end neural networks that map from stimulus to behavior as themselves models of brain and behavior. So models of neural activity in some intermediate steps of computation, and also models of the final behavior that the system performs. So in this case, it's object recognition. And the parallel that computational neuroscientists who use this connectionist paradigm like to draw is that, well, we know that the vision system performs hierarchical computations, so it forms sort of hierarchical features of its input and then uses that as the basis for behavior. Well, also my neural network does the same thing, and that's because initially neural networks were inspired by visual cortex, although this sort of engineering inspiration has diverged from neuroscience a bit in recent years, quite a lot in recent years. But neuroscientists are sort of using these engineering approaches to build better predictive models of brain and behavior. And by predictive model, I'll make it very precise because it sort of features into the problems that I'll pose later. So this is a plot from some early work by the DiCarlo lab, led by Dan Yamens, 2014, so about 10 years ago. And this was sort of the start of using engineering models to try to predict brain and neural activity simultaneously. So this is looking at fitting a neural network to, so sort of on the x-axis, there's the engineering performance of this model. So in this case, it's a very simple multi-class classification task. And Dan Yamens found that as he improved the engineering performance of deep learning models using some augmentation, some other algorithmic techniques that I won't get into, this simultaneously improved neural alignment. So it improved the sort of post hoc fit to neural data. And that was quite exciting because it gives a recipe to construct better models of brain and behavior. That is, just use the same things that the engineers are using. And potentially that allows you to better predict neural activity. Yeah? Yes, so I have a slide which makes exactly precise how this sort of measure is computed. Here, I'll say briefly what they do here. They take the intermediate representation from a neural network, and they linearly regress that to, they use that to linearly regress to population activity from 3 non-human primates. So you sort of record from the vision system, you get some time averaged, space averaged representation of population activity, and you try to find the best linear fit between that and the neural network. And how they quantify that is they look at sort of the R-squared measure, which is a goodness of fit measure in linear regression. But you could come up with other ways of finding this alignments. It's a bit of a cottage industry right now. Okay, any other questions on this framework? Okay. Okay, so this was 2014. What has happened recently? Well, we kind of get the same story. So this is the same sort of plots with engineering performance on the x-axis and brain alignment on the y-axis. And this is using sort of more state-of-the-art models. So I don't see CLIP here, but you can go to the website brainscore.com and get CLIP. And you can see that as we improve engineering performance, and this is averaged over a suite of engineering tasks like ImageNet recognition and other more at-scale visual tasks, that as you improve this engineering performance on the x-axis, you simultaneously improve neural alignment. And there seems to be, we get a bit of diminishing returns, but it seems like this is still a fruitful strategy. And not only does this work for neural alignment, but it also works for behavioral alignment. So cognitive scientists have done the same thing. They've used the same state-of-the-art vision models and tried to predict sort of out-of-distribution human behavior. So you give a human sort of a robustness test, an adversarial example, or an illusion, and you try to predict the behavior of the human on that held out or out of distribution example, and it seems that these models are an even better fit to that sort of out of distribution behavior. So these engineering models are really good predictive models of brain and behavior. Now this is good in one sense because again we have this recipe, just use what the engineers are using, but it doesn't really give us a lot of mechanistic understanding on why this occurs. So why do we get this alignments by just using off-the-shelf models? And if we wanted to do something a little more smart, like try to get better mechanistic models of brain and behavior, i.e. improve the scaling exponent here, we are not able to do so because we're sort of reliant on the engineers to tell us what to do. All right, so this is the sort of problem statement. We have improved predictive accuracy, but we don't have a lot of principles that govern that improvement that would enable us to build more specific or better predictive models of brain and behavior. And what I'm really interested in is trying to understand how a bit more mechanistic understanding of deep neural network training and deep neural network solutions to tasks allow us to better characterize why we might see that neural and behavioral alignment. And one of the work that I'll talk about today on this topic is work from ICML in which we establish a hierarchy of deep linear network solutions to a common task. So what does that mean? Well, given an engineering task, there's many, since deep neural networks are over-parameterized, there's many possible solutions that will implement that input-output mapping, but they differ a lot in their representational structure. And the representational structure is the thing that's of primary interest to us if we're looking at neural alignment, because we're comparing those internal activities in neural networks directly to brain data. And this is not something that's usually considered when people think about solution manifolds. They're usually thinking about things in the parameter space and not in the representation space. All right, so to make that a little bit more concrete, we've known for quite a long time that there's many possible solutions to this learning problem of fitting a deep linear network. Here I'm just picturing a deep linear net of 2 layers. So for instance, I could have this solution, and the way that you can see this is that it's sort of, in terms of matrix factorization, I could find many configurations of W1 and W2 to produce the same composite matrix. In particular, I could permute the columns of W2 and the rows of W1 to produce a different solution, which shares a bit of the representational structure, or I could find a completely distinct set of matrices W1 and W2 that produce the same composite matrix, but differ drastically in terms of how they represent the inputs in their hidden layer, which here would be the outcome of the computation W1 acting on X. And we can sort of play this game. So we're interested in characterizing what are the spaces of possibilities we can have here in these solutions. So in particular, we're interested in this framework of training a deep linear neural network with mean squared error in a regression setting. And we restrict ourselves to the case of no bottlenecks because it's easier to characterize. We know that in this setting, all solutions to solve the task must satisfy this set of constraints. So that's just fitting the task. And we know separately that there are certain properties of the dynamics when we use, for example, gradient descent that determine exactly which configurations of W1 and W2 we end up at when we run a specific algorithm. But that's not what I'll be discussing. Here I'm going to be discussing sort of broader space of possible solutions, and then I'm going to speculate on how that relates to the solutions from applying a specific learning algorithm. So let's consider first this very simple case of a simple task that's ranked efficient. So my input xn has coordinates 2 and 0, and I'm mapping this to a target of 1. Well, how we can understand how the possible solutions to this task is as follows. So we have sort of a general space of solution that's permitted because sort of these parameters W11 and W12 are coupled. We have the least squared solution, which is minimizing the norm of the composite matrix, the product of W1 and W2. We have a minimum representation norm solution. I'm going to make this a bit more precise, which is minimizing something about the activities of this model, the hidden activities of this model, rather than the norm of the weight matrices. And lastly, we have the model with the strongest constraint, which is minimizing simultaneously the separate norms of the weight matrices. And we can realize these constraints as follows. And you can see that they differ in terms of exactly what quantities are sort of implicitly or explicitly minimized, subject to the constraint that it solves the task, which is sort of the constraint that defines this general solution manifold. All right, so that's the sort of, these are the sorts of sets of solutions that we have characterized and tried to understand. I'm going to do a bit of a diversion to describe to you what about the representations of these distinct solutions we're interested in characterizing to understand how they confer high neural alignment or low neural alignment. So in order to do that, I'll explain to you a bit about how people compare brains and neural networks. So in some cases, it's very easy to compare neural data and neural, biological neural data and artificial neural networks. In some cases, for example, in early sensory cortices like V1, we see Gabor filters in biological organisms for many neurons in these early sensory systems, and that's sort of graphically represented on the left here as V1, early visual cortex. And we also see analogous structures in the early layers of vision systems that are trained to perform the task of object recognition. So that's pictured as here as with CNN filters from AlexNet. So this is sort of a canonical example of universality. We see the same thing in different systems, and so then therefore we hypothesize that they're subject to the same sort of learning constraints or the same learning environment. Yeah. Yes, so to get this in a biological system, you would need to look at response maximization properties. So you can think of this as, I want to understand for a single neuron which spatial position or spatiotemporal position, if I'm looking at an auditory region, it maximizes the activity of that neuron. So I basically like get a stimulus with, and find the stimulus that whose position maximizes the activity of that neuron, and then I sort of picture this as a heat map. Yeah. But of course, we don't have a way to directly measure the synaptic weights in a biological neural network. So it's a little bit complicated. But nevertheless, these structures are fairly robust in the early sensory cortices. So it's sort of a agreed upon point that we see Gabor filters in early sensory cortices. We also see a lot of other stuff. I won't address that, and many people don't. But yes, there's a bit of nuance there. Okay, so for certain neural representational structures, the alignment is on site. So we see hallmarks of the same. We could do some parametric fitting, but in some sense, it's not really necessary. It's self-evident that the representational structure of these systems is shared. For later regions in visual cortex, it's not quite so self-evident. So what people normally do is they, in order to compare a brain whose activity is represented on the left here and a neural network whose activity is represented on the right, is they sort of are looking at the representational geometry of different stimulus classes. So here this is looking at, for example, representations of stimuli the stimuli that have people or animals or leaves or inanimate objects. And then we look at the sort of kernel matrix of the different stimulus representations. So the matrix that characterizes the similarity structure between all of these possible stimuli. And that's what's pictured in this matrix. And we can do this for this more general computation for any brain region that we like, as long as we're able to measure neural activity for it. We just need a stimulus data set and the patience to compute similarities across all of the possible stimuli. And again, that's what's represented here. And what's interesting about this particular brain region is that it represents a little bit more the hierarchical nature of the stimuli. So in particular, it's grouping the sort of animate classes differently from the inanimate classes. And that's mirrored by the artificial neural network. And so this sort of qualitative structure and representation is what is being measured when I showed you those earlier plots that have a quantitative measure of neural alignment. And I'll give you a specific example of how we might use those matrices to compute a single quantitative measure of neural alignment. So say I now have a database of stimuli, which is sentences. So I'm likely looking at language models and humans. From a human, I would present the human a database of stimuli, and I would measure, possibly using fMRI, voxel activity from this human, which gives me a matrix, which is the representation of each sentence as a vector. So sort of a high-dimensional neural representation of all of the sentences in my stimulus database, and I would extract analogous representations from the language model by looking at the internal activities of these models. So in particular, just usually take a layer of a neural network, and that becomes this a row in this matrix, this green matrix. And then in the simplest case, I can look at this product, so this sort of gram matrix of my stimulus representations, and that gives me this symmetric matrix of sort of similarities between stimulus representations. And that's the object that people would compare, compute some correlation between. And that correlation value would be the thing that is quantifying the neural alignment. But of course, if you have this red and this green, these analogous representations, you can think of other ways to compute this alignment. For example, linear regression was the example that I gave earlier, where people use the green representations to try to regress to the red representations, and then use the goodness of fit of this linear regressor as this quantity. Okay, so that's how we compute neural alignments. Now moving back to the solution hierarchy that we characterize. So I gave you these sort of explicit characterizations of what these solutions minimize. And another way to think about this is the reason that these are interesting is that they differ in how they treat nuisance dimensions when the input is rank deficient. So in particular, moving from left to right, the solutions that minimize these regularization constraints have increasing constraints on how they're able to map irrelevant dimensions, so observed dimensions of the task that are seen in the training set but are not useful to regress to the target, but also unobserved dimensions that are also irrelevant. So sort of test noise that is not relevant to the task either. And so we can, what we've done is we've explicitly parameterized the possible ways in which these different subspaces can be mapped from input to hidden representation all the way to output in order to try to understand how the task enters into the hidden representations H. So that's the thing that we're primarily interested in, again, because we're looking at neural alignment. So I'll remark on some interesting properties of the solution hierarchy. So again, as I mentioned, going from left to right, there's increasing constraints. There are increasing constraints on null space projections of two kinds, irrelevant but observed and irrelevant but unobserved in the training set. And these last two solution classes are equivalent for whitened data. They would overlap, but here we treat the general case of non-whitened inputs. This case on the right corresponds to a class of solutions that's been recently characterized by one of my colleagues, Clémentine Dominier, and her colleagues. So this is referred to as a balanced solution because we're sort of balancing the contribution of the input to hidden and the hidden to output matrices. And she sort of more generally characterized this by allowing some scaling between those two matrices. And one thing that's particularly interesting about this slightly less restrictive class of minimum representation norm solutions, which again minimizes the norm of the activities of this model acting on the input data, is that it relates to this neural collapse phenomenon. So there's been some work that's looking at how late in training, neural networks seem to maximally distinguish multi-class data according to their class identity, and you can sort of characterize how this comes out through the dynamics. And there's been some sort of analytical characterization of this, which relates it to something like a minimum norm constraint on the representations. And actually, this minimum representation norm solution, as we'll see in the next slide, is to us the most interesting characterization of the most interesting class of solutions. And you'll see why in a second. All right, so let's think about how representations appear in this solution hierarchy. So I'm ignoring the general solution for now because it's not that interesting. If we consider this task which has unwhitened input and hierarchical targets, if we plot the representational similarity matrix, which again is this symmetric matrix of the similarity between stimuli, we see something interesting come out, which is that sort of the most restrictive solution, the minimum weight norm solution, is the one that is not the one that is reflecting the hierarchical structure of the targets. It's actually this minimum representation norm class of solutions that's able to represent this hierarchy. So there's something interesting here that there's a particular subset of the solution hierarchy which is really representing some structure in the input-output map that is not captured by other classes of solutions. So the least square solution would be more general than that. It would contain this minimum representation norm solution, but wouldn't necessarily, actually it might overlap only in the minimum weight norm solution, so it's distinct. The minimum weight norm solution is much more restrictive, and it's this sort of Goldilocks regime of minimizing the activities that allows the hierarchical representation of the targets. And that's interesting to us because, as I mentioned before, to neuroscientists, we're often looking at finding solutions that have sort of this canonical representational structure like sparsity and hierarchy. And so that's why we might care that our representation has this hierarchical structure. All right, so now I'll talk about not just the sort of inspection of these representational similarity matrices, but the consequences that those structures, that those different solutions might have if we compute off-the-shelf neural alignment. So in particular, this is using the same setting as before when I was describing computing neural alignment. So we have two models, and we're trying to find a single quantity that describes the alignment between the internal activities of one and the other. And here we're looking at comparing all of the possible solution classes to each other. So again, ignoring the general class. And we see that, so there's two different comparisons that we can do here. One is across functions, so looking at models that are implementing the different input-output map, and within functions, so models that are implementing the same input-output map. And ideally what we would want is when models are not implementing the same function, we would want to reject want to reject the hypothesis that these models are similar, i.e. we would want near zero correlation according to this measure. And you can see that it's for the models that are involving, for the comparisons that are involving the minimum representation norm solution, in which you get this near zero Pearson correlation. This near zero correlation. So again, it has this restrictive representational structure, and that allows us to reject the hypothesis that the models implementing different functions are not similar correctly. And conversely, when we look at models within a single function, we see that it's only the models that involve a minimum representation, or only the comparisons that involve a minimum representation norm solution, so here the green, that are correctly identifying that these two models are representationally similar when they're also functionally similar. So here we're correctly accepting the hypothesis that these two models are the same in both behavior and representational structure. So you can see why understanding which solution class we are in enables us to with more validity, make these comparisons between two systems, whether it's a neural network and a neural network or a neural network and a brain. And another thing that we looked into was noise robustness. So I'm sorry, I haven't explained to you yet what the x-axis is. So this is sort of just taking a walk along these solution manifolds. So we sort of take a step in a random direction and then optimize the explicit constraint that we've set. We optimize the explicit regularization term corresponding to these different solution classes to get back on the manifold. And you can see that in the case of input noise, the general linear solutions are very sensitive to it. While the minimum representation norm solutions and the minimum weight norm solutions are much less sensitive. So this corresponds to the property that these solutions that are on the right-hand side are constrained in how they're mapping nuisance dimensions to the output variable. And separately for parameter noise, we can see that those solutions that are most susceptible to parameter noise are the solutions on the left-hand side. So the general, sort of the general solution and the least square solution. While the minimum representation norm solution and the minimum weight norm solution are much less susceptible to parameter noise. So they're much more robust. And we can sort of explicitly, analytically characterize this because we have these equations to describe exactly the full range of solution points that characterize these subsets of the solution manifold. All right, so I know what you're thinking. What does this mean for us for nonlinear networks? Well, in the case of nonlinear networks, it's harder to characterize the sort of a similar notion to rank as in deep linear networks. But we can use some tools that people have used to try to understand how we might implement functionally similar networks with expanded parameterizations. And I'll explain to you what tool we used in this paper to try to get an analog with nonlinear networks. It's a set of expansions from this paper from Martinelli et al., from Wolfram Grusner's group. This is a line of work that's been led by Berfins Shimczak. So in this work, they show that in some cases, you can completely characterize the solution manifold of nonlinear networks, in particular in a teacher-student setting with some constraints on the activation function, by using these expansion types. So intuitively, what this means is you take a single neuron, and you can duplicate it by you can split it, which is referred to here as duplication, by sort of duplicating the ingoing weights and duplicating the outgoing weight and dividing it by the number of duplicates that you've added. You can add zero-type neurons that don't have that collectively sum to 0, and those would change the representations of this model, but wouldn't change the output of this model. And they go on to characterize more classes of expansions that allow you to take a single, perhaps minimal nonlinear network and expand it to have some redundant parameters or some duplicated parameters. And that's the thing that we use as analogous to rank in a deep linear network. Okay, so now we're interested in characterizing what consequences these expansions have for similar properties. First, neural alignment, and second, noise. So here is a trained network, so a model that here is representing the hierarchical structure of MNIST. You can see these 10 digit classes along the diagonal, and this is trained from small initial weights, so we expect it to be in the rich learning regime and for it to learn a compact representation of the data set. If we apply a expansion to this model, for example, we apply this linear expansion, we can see that we can arbitrarily change or almost arbitrarily change the latent activity of this model to get it to picture, say, an elephant while maintaining the functional mapping. And simultaneously, we can destroy the representational structure of this model by reducing it to this checkerboard pattern. And now if I was to take this model and to try to compare it to brain activity, it's implementing the same function, and yet I would find a worse fit to brain data. So that would be a false negative result. And similarly for noise robustness, we can see that if we look at this, if we look at models that are augmented by adding neurons that are active on unobserved regions of the input data. So this is analogous to our linear case in which we're looking at solutions that are mapping irrelevant and unobserved dimensions of the subspaces of the input data set to the output. We see that these models that have this off-bound type neurons are very sensitive to input noise, i.e. their test error degrades more quickly than all of the other expansion types. And separately for parameter noise, if we add these duplications, these models with these added duplications are much more sensitive to parameter noise, similarly to input noise. And this is exactly what we saw for different expansion types in deep linear networks, but using these contrast classes of minimal models, like the minimum weight norm solution, the minimum representation norm solution, and expanded parameterizations thereof. So, for example, using all of these expansions. All right, so to sum up, what I've shown you is a hierarchy of deep linear network solutions to a common task. That was of interest to us because we're interested in characterizing representation and not just the parameters of these models. And what the concrete things that we do in this work is we have this exact parametric solution. We characterize exactly the solution manifold for deep linear networks, and we connect different subregions of this manifold explicitly to how they handle noise. And we connect that property of noise handling to representational structure, which is the thing that matters to us if we're comparing neural networks to brain data, to biological neural network. And then we show that there's an empirical generalization of this to a notion of rank in nonlinear networks by looking at these different ways of duplicating neurons while keeping the function the same. And one thing we're exploring right now is to use other frameworks like teacher-student in nonlinear networks to try to characterize similar notions of noise handling and rank to the case of nonlinear networks and how that interacts with dynamics and representational structure. And then I'll give a shout out to a work that I didn't talk about, but I'm happy to chat about offline, which is using this data setting from Sebastian and Alessandro Ingrosso, which is trying to characterize the structure of naturalistic image data in order to determine when sparsity structure appears in a nonlinear neural network. And in this context, we were looking at analyzing the task conditions for why we get that structured solution in a single nonlinear neuron. So I'm happy to talk about that as well, and I want to mention it because it's related to this idea of characterizing representational structure and how that relates to task structure in a way that would matter if we're trying to compare internal representations of artificial neural networks to biological neural networks. And lastly, I'll give some broad points. So the way that I think about this set of problems is that, well, first of all, connectionism promises to allow us to quantitatively test hypotheses about the mind and brain using complicated deep neural networks. However, in this line of work, we've shown that we need to be careful with blindly applying these representational neural alignment measures due to the fact that there's a lot of representational flexibility in neural network models, both deep linear networks and deep nonlinear networks, and there's qualitative differences in solutions. In particular, in some cases, we find that we see the hierarchical structure of the task represented, or we see that there's sparsity represented in these artificial neural networks. And that should matter to us if we're primarily interested in representation and not function. So I hope that I convinced you that the work I presented gives us some tools to address this internal validity problem of representational comparisons. In particular, when we're doing these comparisons, we need to account for the solution type and also the degree of flexibility within that solution type in order to correctly accept or reject hypotheses when we're comparing neural networks and neural networks. All right, so that's all I had, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Erin, for the very interesting talk. There's a bit of time for questions.